Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 11, which is going to talk about technology, culture, and everyday life in antebellum America. The quiz on Canvas is also up and available, and I hope that you are watching this and completing the quiz at the same time. So, without further ado, we will get started. So, we see some major technological developments, particularly in the field of agriculture, which have huge impact on the western United States. John Deere introduces the steel-tipped plow, which makes it easier to plow through the thick roots in the western grasslands, also cutting labor for plowing in half. The biggest cash crop in the West, the cotton of the Northwest, if you like, is wheat. And the McCormick Reaper, introduced in 1834, plays a huge role in the efficiency of harvesting wheat. The Reaper could harvest grain roughly 7 times faster than one could do it with the traditional method. And in fact, the efficiency of farming, particularly in the field of wheat farming, gives a huge advantage to the North when they fight the Civil War in 1860, as the ability to efficiently grow crops at the same level that we were producing prior to the war with fewer people, which is what mechanization ultimately helps us do, is a massive boon, and that we can keep the food production up on the northern front and supply soldiers for the fighting. Interestingly as well, the McCormick Reaper is invented by a Southerner. People, however, in the West tended to farm rather wastefully, preferring to seek out virgin or uncultivated soil rather than attempting to improve worn-out soil. However, eastern farmers, where territory is far more limited and didn't have as much option for moving on to virgin soil, began to experiment with fertilizing and other methods for improving worn-out soil in order to compete with the usually far more productive western farmers. We also see some pretty amazing innovations in the realm of industry, particularly with the introduction of the American system of manufacturing. Now, not to be confused with the American system, which is more of a political thing, championed by Henry Clay, and includes things like federal funds for internal improvements, tariffs, and other measures like that. The American system of manufacturing was a method of manufacturing which utilized increased mechanization as well as the introduction of interchangeable parts. Now, this had some very clear advantages. One, interchangeable parts meant that damaged parts could be replaced rather than having to discard an entire product. And two, improved machine tools also meant that inventors could push inventions out into mass production a lot faster, and as a result, out onto the market a lot faster as well. We also see the introduction of the telegraph, which Americans very quickly seized on for its ability to eliminate constraints on time and space as far as communication is concerned, and that is particularly important in a country as large as the United States. And so we moved very quickly to develop a telegraph system on the country. You also have railroads making huge impacts. Now, they are still in their infancy as businesses go, and that's because there are some early issues. First of all, people tended to ride in open cars, and this could be potentially dangerous as sparks from the cars would often shower down on passengers. Eventually, carriages did move to closed railroad cars, thus eliminating that danger. Early railroad cars also didn't have any brakes, so passengers would often have to get off in order to help stop the train. And yet again, eventually brakes were installed. Early trains also didn't have any lights, and so they could not run at night, but they soon adopted the use of lamps for night travel. Scheduling was a huge problem for trains, and the solution that ultimately is come up with is time zones. It is, in fact, trains in 1883. The desire to see the trains run on time, that we see the introduction of time zones in 1883. This also helps the telegraphs, too. Different railroads also had a tendency to use different track gauges, which meant that different cars were required to run over different tracks. And so, if you needed to send cargo, or if you were a passenger who was traveling a distance which required you to use different lines, then you would have to change trains in order to continue on your journey, or if it's cargo, you would have to unload and then reload them onto another train. Eventually, we do get a standard gauge as well, which makes train travel and train shipping much less hassle involved, I guess. Trains also had a difficulty climbing steep grades in their earlier forms, and would continue to do so until more powerful engines are introduced. However, despite these early setbacks, train tracks grew rapidly throughout the United States. Between 1840 and 1860, track mileage across the country grew from a mere 3,000 miles of track to 30,000 miles of track. The introduction of train lines helped to stimulate settlement westward, as it moved people more efficiently out into more remote areas as well. Trains also, or the railroad generally, also changed the way that business was conducted, as the railroads represent the first big business in the United States, and securities for railroads were traded on the New York Stock Exchange, which would ultimately expand out to include securities for other industries as well, and also introduces New York City as the modern center of investment firms in the United States. With all of these introductions, we also see a huge rise in prosperity, which generally and drastically improves the lives of consumers. Prices go down as goods become much easier to produce and are produced in mass. And we also see a roughly 25% rise in the real income for the average worker due to the use of steam-powered factories and things like that could remain open even if rivers or streams froze over. The growth of towns also contribute to the increase in income and offer more opportunities for year-round work. Opportunities are also available in the paid labor force for women and children, which are much harder to find in the rural areas. All of this technology and innovation also has drastic effects on people's quality of life and how they get from day to day. The first place that we see these changes is in where people live. Dwellings change drastically during this period. The more common sort of randomly sited wood frame houses that featured in towns in earlier generations were now replaced within cities by the more orderly row houses. Row houses are basically a line of attached houses, usually made of brick, and became very common features throughout cities in the United States. If you would like, you can think of row houses as essentially one extremely long building that is simply subdivided into multiple houses. For middle class dwellers, their row houses could also include interesting details in order to cut down on the uniformity of the row houses, which are, like, say, basically one giant subdivided building, and they often focused a lot of time and energy on beautifully and furnished interiors as well. For the working class, though, row houses were often further subdivided in order to fit several families within what was considered a single house. The worst of these subdivided houses were referred to as tenements, and often housed the very poorest of workers, which in this period are usually Irish immigrants. Rural housing, however, still remained relatively crude, often a rude log cabin with planked floors. Although balloon frame houses were taking over as the go-to for more substantial housing, as they were easier and cheaper to construct than the traditional log house. Along with these changes in the way that houses look, we also have the introduction of a variety of modern conveniences. Things like coal-burning stoves, which ultimately replaced open hearths for both heating and cooking houses. This was very nice in that you could cook several dishes at once, which helped to diversify the diet. It also helped that the railroad brought in fresh fruit and vegetables from other places to the city, which also aided in diversifying the diet. However, only rich people generally could afford produce that was technically out of season. And coal burning stoves often left dirty soot everywhere, as well as contributing to air pollution. So it did have its disadvantages as well. You do have urban waterworks introduced that could bring fresh water into cities. And while these waterworks were impressive, only a fraction of people actually lived near enough to take advantage of them. And so most families still had no running water, which meant that bathing was still something of a rarity. Infrequent bathing also meant that it smelled most of the time, and municipal sanitation was severely lacking. Oftentimes, livestock would roam the streets freely, and flush toilets were extremely rare. Another potential modern convenience, however, that was only really available to the wealthy, were ice boxes, which could preserve fresh produce by using essentially a box full with a big block of ice in it, hence the name. But again, this is still pretty confined to those that could afford it, and so the main preservative for most people is still salt. We also see, as a result of the growth in population, particularly the movement towards the cities, and the increased ability of people to move about the country freely with the transportation revolution, we see a growth in disease epidemics. These epidemics could sweep very rapidly through cities and could also be rapidly carried to other cities as people moved about. Medicine at this time is still fairly medieval in the way that it understands disease and the human body and so on. And the failure of physicians to explain these epidemics or to prevent them meant that they tended to lose social standing in this period, as we've already discussed. However, while physicians are losing their social standing, surgeons are improving theirs with the introduction of anesthesia. Young people often used laughing gas as a party entertainment, but one of these young people, a man called Crawford Long, recognized that this laughing gas had the ability also to suppress pain and could potentially have surgical applications, and so employed it in its liquid form during a surgical procedure. Other surgeons very quickly picked up on it, and it became common practice. This greatly helped to improve their image from the more traditional sort of butcher surgeon type image to someone that's a little bit more respected, as it allowed for longer and more careful operations. However, the germ theory of disease is still something that we haven't discovered yet, and so surgeons still didn't wash their hands before performing an operation, meaning that infections are still quite common, and so amputations, as a result, are still a regular practice. Much like today, you also have popular health fads that catch on in the country. Hydropathy was one, which was essentially taking cold baths as a promise, with the promise of cleansing, renovating, and rejuvenating a disease-worn system. You also have diet fads, for example. Sylvester Graham urged a change in the diets of people, encouraging a diet that is rich in fruits and vegetables with whole grain bread, which he conveniently supplied for you. It was known as Graham bread, and abstaining from richer foods like meat, spices, coffee, tea, and alcohol, even recommending abstention from sexual excesses. Graham bread eventually morphs into a better known product today, which you may even have in your houses right now, graham crackers. We also see emerging popularly in this period phrenology. Phrenology was considered democracy at work, as it's based on the belief that everyone could master their own destiny in some way. Phrenology is based on the idea that the human mind is comprised of 37 distinct faculties, or organs. Each of these organs is located in a different part of the brain. strength of each depended on its size, and so therefore character could be assessed by studying the shape of the head, and one could improve one's character through the proper management of these organs. Americans were drawn to the practice particularly because it promised a quick way to size up someone's character and also to improve your own. And the promise of universal improvement was irresistible to Americans at this time. We also see democracy at work in our pastimes that are popular in America. The first place we see this change is in newspapers. In 1830, the typical American newspaper was only about 4 pages long, and its front and back pages were devoted almost entirely to advertisements. This left the 2 remaining middle pages, which contained a mixture of editorials, details of ship arrivals and cargoes, reprints of political speeches or events. These papers generally did not rely on circulation for money, but they did receive subsidies from political groups with which they were affiliated. Technological improvements increased both the supply of paper available as well as the speed of production for newspapers, and enterprising journalists responded by introducing the penny press. Now, the penny press did rely on mass circulation for profit. However, they revolutionized marketing as well as the content of the newspapers, and as well as the production of newspapers. Here we see, in order to sell more newspapers, a reduction in the amount of political and commercial commentary, and an increase in the number of human interest stories and sensationalist news, thus appealing to a wider audience. Theater is also an extremely popular pastime for Americans in the antebellum period, and increasingly attempted to appeal to mass audiences. Large theaters would draw people from all social classes, and it's one of the few places where you would have members of all social classes massed together in one place. Audiences were notoriously ill-behaved. The lower orders, who were usually standing in the pit, would crack peanuts, spit tobacco, get drunk, talk loudly. They stamped their feet and booed at villains, threw garbage at characters or performers they didn't like. So it could be pretty rowdy. The most popular plays were emotionally charged melodramas in which virtue is rewarded, vice is punished, and the hero wins the girl. And no one does an emotionally charged melodrama better than William Shakespeare, who was the single most popular dramatist in antebellum American theater. Now, theater managers quite often adapted the plays of Shakespeare to fit popular modern audiences by highlighting sword fights and assassinations, cutting short some of the speeches, and occasionally substituting happy endings for the sad ones in the originals. Another form of popular entertainment, also theatrical in nature, were minstrel shows. The popular minstrel shows of the 1840s and 50s were forged during a period of intense sort of racial relations, and forged an enduring racial stereotypes that served to buttress white Americans' sense of superiority by diminishing Black Americans. These minstrel shows often featured white performers wearing burnt cork, blackface, who would entertain their audiences with songs and dances and humorous sketches, pretending to mimic Black culture. Most of its contents were purely inventions aimed at expressing and reinforcing the prejudices of the working class white audience, and it tended to depict Black Americans as stupid, clumsy, and absurdly musical. One of the more famous entertainers of the day was P.T. Barnum, considered the father of mass entertainment in the United States because he quite thoroughly understood how to profit from the public's demand for stimulation and excitement. In 1834, Barnum launched his career as an entertainment entrepreneur and got his start by exhibiting a Black woman named Joyce Heth, who he billed as the 169-year-old former slave wet nurse of George Washington. People flocked to gawk at this woman and the impossibility of her existence. When audiences began to dwindle, Barnum wrote an anonymous piece to a local newspaper saying that Joyce Heth is not a human being at all, but an automaton made up of whalebone, India rubber, and numberless springs. The accusations, of course, enticed people who had already gone to see the exhibit once to come back and see if they could determine whether or not this was a real person or a machine. In 1841, Barnum purchases a rundown museum in New York City and renames it the American Museum. Now, the name is somewhat misleading in that Barnum cared less for education than he did for entertainment. However, he did draw throngs of people stimulated by their own curiosity. People coming to the museum could see ventriloquists, magicians, albinos. One of his favorite exhibits was a 25-inch tall 5-year-old whom Barnum named General Tom Thumb. You can see in the picture there with Barnum. And the Fiji mermaid, billed by Barnum as positively asserted by its owner to have been taken alive in the Fiji Islands. This institution in 1850 was the most popular museum in America. After 1820, the United States also experienced a flowering of literature, referred to as the American Renaissance. Leading figures of this American Renaissance included recognizable names like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Edgar Allan Poe. American writers often sought to depict the national features of the United States, its land, and its people in their work. And there are two broad developments as well that contribute to this cultural flowering of the American Renaissance. One is economic, and that is the transportation revolution, which helped to create a national market for books, particularly fictional novels. One could now publish a book in New York City, say for example, and distribute that book all across the country, selling it everywhere from Philadelphia to Charleston, South Carolina, to New Orleans in Louisiana. The other major development was more philosophical in nature, and this is the emergence of the movement called Romanticism. Now, contrary to what the name would suggest, Romanticism has very little to do with actual romantic love. Instead, Romanticism insists that literature reveal the longings of the individual author's soul. Romantics valued the emotional expressiveness of literature and its truthfulness to its creator's inner feelings. The emergence of a national book market and the Romantic movement combined to make American literature much more democratic. Women also began to tap into the growing market for literature, with fiction writing becoming the most lucrative occupation for women before the Civil War. And the most popular form of fiction in the 1840s and 50s was the sentimental or domestic novel, mostly written by women for women. Another popular genre in the antebellum reading market was sensationalist fiction, which drew on such dark romantic themes as criminality, mystery, and horror, but took them to extremes unknown even in the works of Hawthorne, Melville, or Poe. Writers also benefited from advances in printing technology, which significantly reduced the price of books, thus opening them up to a wider market of readers. By the 1840s, cheap paperbacks costing as little as 7 cents were flooding the market, and those who did not purchase books could read fiction in story newspapers such as the weekly New York Ledger, which devoted itself mainly to serializing novels. In addition to the spread of public schools, the spread of public schools and academies contributed to a higher literacy rate within the country, thus also widening the audience for fiction. As American writers were trying to create a distinctly American literature, American painters were searching for a national style in art, and many turned to landscape painting. The Hudson River School was the center of American landscape painting in the 19th century, which is best represented by the works of people like Thomas Cole or Frederick Church. What Hudson River painters contributed to American art was a romantic emphasis, yet again, on emotional effect over illustrative accuracy. By the 1830s, romantic city dwellers were also creating little enclaves of nature as spiritual antidotes to the sprawling urban development. Some of these enclaves, the so-called rural cemeteries, were landscaped cemeteries with names like Harmony Grove or Greenwood, which sprang up near major cities and offered curving, tree-lined lanes, artificial ponds for the enjoyment of strolling city dwellers. Other natural enclaves were urban parks, which were often carefully crafted to resemble the countryside. In 1858, New York City chose a plan to draw a landscaped park by landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux for the proposed Central Park. They designed the park to screen out the surrounding city, planting bordering trees in order to conceal nearby buildings and constructing 4 sunken thoroughfares to carry traffic unobtrusively across the park. Now I have here 4 examples of romantic art that came from this period. This one by Albert Bierstadt is called Immigrants Crossing the Plains, and we have some key features that appear oftentimes in romantic paintings. First of all, the scene is quite epic in nature with giant tall trees and these imposing cliffs in the background and the startling sort of sunset and the clouds that are all there, which make the scene look really epic and amazing. The settlers, as you can see, are moving from a darker side of the canvas towards a lighter side, a kind of visual representation of progress. And the movement of the canvas also goes from dark to light as the people are moving, and you can even see a tilt in the way that the trees lean towards the light and the cliffs indicate that direction as well. In this piece, quite famous by Emanuel Lutz, Washington Crossing the Delaware, we see a focus on national heroism, which inspires a lot of romantic artists. The picture here shows George Washington quite proudly and heroically standing at the front of this tiny little ship as it dramatically makes its way across the frozen Delaware River. You can see the American flag quite prominently displayed as well, invoking that romantic idea of the American myth. Here we have another scene that uses again that idea of movement as well as the contrast between light and dark. So yet again we have a darker side of the canvas on the right and a lighter side on the left. The eye is sort of drawn from the right to the left as you have trees as well as the mountain in the background and even the clouds angling and pointing in that direction. You also see the theme of the idea of primitive innocence, as you can see Native Americans and their dwellings portrayed on the bottom portion of the painting. The title of it is Course of an Empire, the Savage State by Thomas Cole, and even as he denotes the natives as savage, there is a kind of appreciation for, again, that simplicity and innocence almost inherent in that kind of a lifestyle. The last example I have for you is Vesuvius in Pompeii by Robert Scott Duncanson. This also highlights another aspect of Romanticism, which is a particular affinity for ancient civilization, as well as an affinity for ruins of ancient civilizations. The Romantics quite often liked the tragic beauty, I guess you could say, of ruins of these past ancient and glorious civilizations. Vesuvius here, of course, is referring to the mountain that destroyed the city of Pompeii, the volcano rather, that destroyed the city of Pompeii in Italy, and so the civilization on display here is Rome itself, which the Romantics particularly liked as well. So that pretty much wraps up the discussion here about Chapter 11 with Culture and Society. I hope that you've all been following along with your Canvas quiz. Do be sure to turn that in so you can make sure to get a grade for it. And I will see you in class. Thank you.